Mike, check 1212. It's the Y2K collector, and everyone keeps saying that retro video games are not worth it anymore. Collecting retro games isn't worth it anymore. Um, a lot of people are complaining about the prices of retro video games. A lot of people are saying that it's way too expensive, that retro games are dead. And we hear a lot of the gripe around retro games honestly is stemming from the price point, the prices that people feel like they have to pay to be able to enjoy retro video games. But here's the reality. Here's the truth about retro video games is that there's only a small percentage of retro video games that are truly expensive, like really expensive. And by really expensive, I mean I'm gonna label expensive as like $80 and above. And the reason why I'm doing that is because like I just picked up a PlayStation 5, and most of the games that I'm looking at for picking up on the PlayStation 5 are at least $70. Now, don't get me wrong, there are retro games that are exceptionally expensive. Here's one, right? Now, this isn't even a US release. This is actually a game that was only released in Japan. It's called Hyperduel, and this is a $600 game, right? So I get it. If you went out and you were trying to buy 10 games that were $600 a pop, I would totally understand it. But for someone who just bought a PlayStation 5 and is looking at what games he can pick up, most of those games are $60 to $70. So what I'm going to label as an expensive game is a game that's $80 or above. When you look at most retro games, when I even look at my collection, there's a handful. I would say maybe, and my collection might be a little bit different, right? Because I have a particular taste in games. But I would say that at least 50% of my collection is made up of games that are worth less than $50. Less than $50. So if we're comparing dollars to dollars, like how much you're actually spending on a game when it comes to retro games versus new games, on average, it's not even close. Most new games, as like for the PlayStation 5, are going to cost you way more than what you would spend for most retro games. I mean, even if we look at the game, like and this is a small sample size of GameCube games. Out of this lot of GameCube games that I've got here before you, there might be maybe 10 of these games, if that, 10, maybe 15 out of, I don't know, 40 or so games that are worth more than $40. You've got games like X-Men Legends, X-Men Legends 2, Mario Tennis, Marvel, Rise of the Imperfects, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, Shadow, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles games, Beautiful Joe, Fantastic Four, Hulk, Sonic Riders, the Spider-Man games. You've got a lot of games here that are less than $40. Even if you look at the PlayStation 2, a lot of these PlayStation 2 games, don't get me wrong, a lot of these PlayStation 2 games are expensive, but you still got a lot of games in here that are less than $40. Same thing on the 360. Again, my collection is probably not the collection to go off of because I do have a tailored taste, and a lot of the games in my collection are expensive. But if you're just looking to play some of the more common retro games, like Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo isn't costing you more than $10, $15. Most Nintendo games aren't costing you more than $10 or $15. But what I think is happening is most people are looking at the more expensive games. They're looking at the games that maybe they want to have, but they know are just too expensive. And then they're kind of painting with a broad brush. And they're just saying, oh, well, all retro games are super expensive. They're either doing that, or I think in people's minds, when it comes to older games and retro games, I think subconsciously they think because the game is older or because the game is 20 years old, it should be a certain price point, when that's not how things work. the items are going to cost whatever people are willing to pay for them. Period. So if you're looking at a game like a PlayStation 1 game that's, I don't know, $100, and you're saying, well, it's not worth it to me, well, it's going to be worth it to someone else. But again, there's only a small percentage of the PlayStation 1 library that has games that are worth $100 or more. There are thousands of PlayStation 2 games, thousands of PlayStation 1 games that barely scratch the surface of $40. But I think people tend to concentrate on the more expensive games because those are usually the games that are highlighted in YouTube videos, or those are the games that, in a lot of cases, are really fun. And again, I understand that, which is why, for me, when I went through the process and I continually go through the process of, sorting out my collection and curating my collection, that's a big part of the reason why I've made the sacrifice. And I've taken a lot of my cheaper games that maybe I either beat already or I just didn't really find that fun, and traded those in for some of my some of the more expensive games that I have in my collection. But that was a choice that I had to make. Now I have a PlayStation 5, and as I'm looking at what games I want to get on the PlayStation 5, I'm realizing that new games are just as expensive. First of all, the PlayStation 5 console itself even if you go and get a used one at GameStop, like a Slim with the disc drive, it's going to be at least $500 for the console. Most of the games are going to be $60 to $70. And then you got to think about all the add-ons, right? Like, if you decide to get a DualSense Edge controller, that's another $200 for a controller. I mean, everything is more expensive with these newer systems. And I'm not complaining about it, because when you factor in inflation, it's probably right on par with where video games, with what video games have cost over the years. But I think just people look at retro games and they say, well, these games shouldn't be costing more than $5, and you still have people who have that mindset that say, well, this retro game shouldn't cost more than $10, or I paid $10 for this game, back in 2006, or I paid $5 for, this game back in 2011. And that's like me pulling up to a gas station, seeing that the gas is $5 a gallon, and saying, well, I paid $1.50 for gas back in '05 or back in '06. Like, no one cares about that. Today it's a new day. And these are the prices for things today. So I don't really know how to feel at this stage when people say retro gaming is too expensive. I think we have to be a little bit more specific and about what games we're talking about. And we got to be careful to not paint with a broad brush, because are there very expensive retro games? For sure. For sure. I'm not going to stand here and say that there aren't. Definitely. Definitely. There are retro games that are super expensive, but then there are also modern games that are super expensive. I mean, Godzilla on the PlayStation 4, right? That's a $300 game. But to the people who have that game, they're not complaining about it. The Messenger on the Nintendo Switch, that's a $200 game, $250 game. And that's on the Switch. And again, it's that much because that's what people are willing to pay for it. So whether a game is retro or whether a game is modern, if it's a game that a lot of people like, if it's a game that a lot of people find value in, the price is going to get marked up, and there's nothing that you can do about it. The only difference is, in my opinion, there are more cheap retro games than there are cheap modern games. Because most PlayStation 5 games today, unless it's a game that got severe markdown or is just absolutely trash or is on clearance, most PlayStation 5 games are going to be more expensive than most retro games, because most retro games are cheap. If you're a person who you want to curate a collection that's tailored and made up of a lot of expensive games, or if you're a person who maybe you've got a large collection of retro games, maybe you've got thousands of retro games, but a lot of those games are, cheaper games, and maybe you want to start getting some more expensive games, then that's where I think the perception of retro games are just far too expensive. I think that's where that's going to come from. But if you look at it, I mean, it's tomato to me. But I'm interested to know what you guys think about this, because it's something that I've been seeing, and I've seen a lot of comments on, even on my channel, about it, about retro games just being too expensive, not worth it. I mean, in comparison to what? And you know, yeah, you just, in comparison to what? Cheap in relation to what? What are you comparing the price of certain retro games to? Are you comparing them to modern retro games? Are you comparing them to the price that they were back when they first released? Are you comparing them to the price that they were when no one was like looking for them? We got to get out of this mindset of I shouldn't have to pay more than $5 for the Super Nintendo game, because that's like saying, that's like me saying, I should be able to go out and buy a house for $200,000. It just doesn't exist. Like, it's over. Like, that season is over. That time has passed, and we got to get over it and come to terms with what the prices are today, because it is what it is. And I think if you want to enjoy it, this hobby, this is what you'll have to pay. Either that, or you can go emulate. I think emulation is definitely a viable option for a lot of people. Finding other ways of enjoying the games is, there's a lot of ways that you can enjoy the games. You don't necessarily have to collect physical. It's not a must. It's not a requirement for you to play and enjoy the games. But for the folks who do want to buy physical retro games, for the folks that do want this stuff, you got to walk into it knowing that there will be certain games that are going to be expensive. There will be certain games that you're going to have to shell out for, because they're games that people want. It's just the nature of supply and demand. But let me know what you think down in the comments. It's the Y2K Collector, just doing a little bit more sorting here. I'll catch you in the next video. Take it easy.